Greetings, this is Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review. This one is in the May 1972 issue of Analog Science Fiction Science Fact, the direct successor of Astounding Science Fiction. At this particular time, still being edited by Ben Bova. So John Campbell is gone, passed away, but the magazine goes on, life goes on, and Asimov's stories go on. Now this time, it's listed here in the table of contents as mirror image, Isaac Asimov, page 149. So let's take a look at what's on page 149. And what we have here is a piece of artwork. The whole page is dominated by a single piece of artwork. You can see here two guys. This is probably Elijah Bailey. He's got his pipe. He's got the notes that will have been brought to him to review. And this person standing here with perfect looking features is almost certainly robot Daneel Olivaw. Yes, from the same story. We'll talk about that momentarily. And then this would be one of the robots. They interviewed two robots via television, and they would have looked identical, so it could have been either one of them. Well, what are these two robots, and what is robot Daneel Olivaw doing here in this short story? This story actually follows upon the heels, with some delay, of two great novels. Originally, The Caves of Steel, and then later on, The Naked Sun. Both of those stories were based on Elijah Bailey, who was a plainclothesman, which is to say a particular form of police officer. And he was associated, he's introduced in the first of these stories, and after a while he kind of has to get used to being with the interesting character, to robot or R. Daneel Olivaw, R being for robot. So robot Daneel Olivaw. And these two have their adventures. They get to know each other and learn to cooperate and carry out a difficult case in a futuristic New York City, which has become a fully enclosed cave of steel, as it were, because everyone's kind of had it to hear with the weather and rainy days and hot and cold and whatever else. So they just have a giant dome over the whole city, and it's like a cave of steel, so to speak. So with that cave of steel, that is the world of the future, and there's kind of a deal where robots are not very popular here on the earth. I guess they're afraid that they'll take the place of people who do work and get people unemployed, and that's not a good thing, obviously. Although later on it would turn out there could be an idea behind all this. Well, we can get to that. That will be discussed in those stories. So, but anyway, it was kind of neat. That the first book came out back in it was serialized in the pages of Galaxy magazine in 1953, but the book itself made its appearance in early 1954. The next one, The Naked Sun, came out in 1957. In between, another unrelated novel of his, The End of Eternity, came out. So, in 1957, it is both serialized and the book comes out on the pages of Astounding Science Fiction. So, we got two good stories here, and people wanted more. Now, there is a point where apparently towards the end of the 50s he was developing or drafting yet a third story. I think he was going to call it The Bounds of Infinity or something like that. That was supposed to kind of continue the adventures of these two characters further. But we're looking at a time when suddenly he decided to kind of curtail his writing of fiction, as suddenly the writing of fact was turning out to be a lot more fun for him, and B, something he felt was really needed at a time when the United States had found itself caught up short in that the Soviet Union was already putting things in orbit and living creatures and later on people. Before we, it seemed like for a while there was all, the Russians had it first was kind of the going slogan at the time. So we needed to catch up. We needed to really enhance our science education and stop resting on our laurels of, oh, look at all the great things our country's done in the past. Well, what have we done lately? So between those two things, and maybe other reasons as well, his writing of fiction trailed off to, if you follow these stories, you get to a point where, there's a whole bunch in the 30s, in the late 30s and 40s. Only 3 show out in the 1930s, but there was like a dozen stories floating around that would show up in the early 1940s, and then there's a good solid sprinkling of them, including virtually all the stories of I, Robot, and also the stories of the Foundation series. So, those were important writings. And then as you get into the 50s, it's like every year's got something like a dozen or more stories. It was just cranking out. But as you get to the end of the 50s and into the early 60s and all the 1960s, you get some whole years where nothing gets written. And maybe, like in 1963, nothing's written, nothing's published. 1964, nothing's written. A very old story hanging over from the 1940s that didn't get published way back when finally surfaces, but that's not any new writing on his part, and so forth. And the next year you have just a very few stories, a little trickle. Some years it just might be one thing published in the whole year. And so things are still kind of trickling along. And in all of that, he decides, rather than develop the third Elijah Bailey Robot Daneel Olivaw novel, whatever he was starting to draft, he abandoned that and instead decided to write a short story that would at least allow his readership a brief reacquaintance with his 2 lovable characters. And so here they are. It's much later on in the 1980s, having written Foundation's Edge, that he finally decides to continue a third novel full length, which becomes The Robots of Dawn, and then another novel after that, Robots and Empire, that by the time we get to that one, Elijah Bailey is gone. In Robots of Dawn, Elijah Bailey is still with us, but in Robots and Empire, Elijah Bailey is a memory, but Robot Daneel Olivaw is still with us, and in fact, eventually even turns up in Foundation and Earth, so that's kind of cool. So this is a character of some importance, and certainly every time we see him, he's always of some interest, even though this is just a short story. Well, Daneel Olivaw is on a spaceship going from somewhere to somewhere, and aboard that spaceship along with him and a captain who's very supportive of all these things happening are these 2 mathematicians. One or the other of them has invented some extraordinary mathematical theory, and the problem is each is convinced, or at least saying, that they came up with it. They ran the idea past the other, who said, wow, that's really great, and they're ready to publish. But the other guy saying, then I'm the one who came up with it, and I ran past this guy, you see. And so we got ourselves a rivalry going on. Who actually developed this theory? And no, they did not develop it together. Clearly, one of them knew it, one of them didn't. So how is he going to solve that issue? And it's just everything's so symmetrical, and you can't just, wait till you get to Aurora. That's where it was on its way to, and be among all your fellow mathematicians at some mathematicians conference or something they're going to, where there'll be tons of peers. No, this needs to be solved before that. Well, turns out each of these characters have brought along their assistant robots who further turn out to be an identical model from an identical time, roughly. Other than that one has a different serial number than the other. You don't have the number. It's just a pattern that varies slightly from one to the other. They tell you so you can tell them apart. But other than that, they're identical robots, and these robots were in the room. They can even recount the entire conversation. But one of them will recount it in the voice of the one mathematician having told the story, and having told the theory, and the other going along with it and approving it, and the other will tell the exact same dialogue, except that it's the other one who came up with the theory and propounded it, and the first one I mentioned who is saying, yeah, this is a good thing. So what exactly happened, and how is this going to be solved? And what can Elijah Bailey do about this? How can he solve what is fundamentally a very difficult problem to solve? There's very little. He has to talk these robots through kind of a television transmission type screen, like we saw in the drawing. There was the robot there. It's on the wall, projected on the wall, kind of like a sort of projection TV system. And meanwhile, there's our two characters in a room together. It's really nice. They make this nice contact. Oh, they did have a very brief and rather mechanical sparing about all this. Robot Daneel paused momentarily, said a shade too quickly, and yet there are rules of human behavior which I have learned. It would seem, for instance, that I am deficient in etiquette by human standards not to have asked after your wife and kid. And he says, well, they are doing well. The boy is in college, and Jesse is involved in local politics. The amenities are taken care of. So now tell me what brings you here. So, and that was that. So Jesse got into politics. Okay. I don't know. She becomes kind of an irrelevant figure for the most part, but the first novel, she's actually kind of important to the story. So how does he solve this? Well, the only thing he really can do, besides reviewing some other information that doesn't really prove that helpful, is to question the robots over the long distance. He and Elijah Bailey are on Earth. The robots are on board the ship that is kind of hovering about somewhere near the Earth, near enough to be able to communicate. I don't know if it's in orbit or where, but somewhere that they can communicate. And the captain is keeping it there because it was the Olivaw's idea that the captain said, I got a problem. He confides with Olivaw, who says, well, I know somebody who's really great with these kinds of things. And next thing you know, they're stopping by the Earth instead of some other place they might have reasonably stopped on between one jump and another from one place to another. And so while they're staying there at this one jump, Elijah Bailey goes down to Earth, visits Elijah Bailey, just walks in and says, wow, what are you doing here? It's really kind of a neat thing. And of course, they're all glad to see each other and catch up a little bit like you saw. And then this is the thing to solve. So that's all who's part of the whole thing. The mathematicians, the captain of the ship, robot Daneel Olivaw, and Elijah Bailey playing clothesmen. So these are the only characters. We don't even see or hear a word from the captain of the ship, or even the two mathematicians. Only their robots can be interviewed. So he starts interviewing each of them, and he starts realizing, well, a robot wouldn't just lie, but they might lie if they felt by first law that somebody might be harmed if they didn't. So he kind of manages to extract a somewhat asymmetrical response from the robots. And all of this stuff could be read multiple ways. It's kind of ambiguous, but he does have something else. There's one other disparity between the two mathematicians. One is older. We're talking spacers. And if you remember from the spacers in the Caves of Steel and the Naked Sun, and perhaps even also, and of course the Robots of Dawn and Robots in Empire, a few spacers are left. And I'm not sure, but I think you'll even see these in the spacers of the Lucky Star series, which is almost the only other place you see these spacers living on their 50 worlds and so forth. So the the spacers apparently live for several hundred years. Okay, ordinary Earthers have ordinary spans consistent with what we're familiar with human beings today. So the older one is about 270 something years old, or 270 years as a mathematician, I'm not sure which. And he's had a long, illustrious career. But, he's getting on in years and so forth. But, he's had a long, illustrious career, brilliant, probably the greatest mathematician in the galaxy. Meanwhile, you got this young upstart who's not even 50 yet. So, I mean, he's young enough that he could have been like an Earthman so far. Well, he's going to live out that long, too. Assuming all goes well for him. And he, is young. And that's the only other asymmetry to the whole thing. That gave him a clue. I will not spoil that clue. You'll need to read the story. The story is gathered up for the first time in a collection. Sadly, I don't have the cover. I just have the art of the best of Isaac Asimov. This book has a number of stories. All the rest of these have been gathered into various other collections. It has Marooned Off Vesta, which was in Asimov's Mysteries because it gets paired with another one also included here called Anniversary. I've covered each of those stories earlier in this series. Then there's Nightfall. That's in Nightfall and Other Stories. Then there's Sea Shoot, also in Nightfall and Other Stories. The Martian Way and the Deep, that are, of course, in The Martian Way and Other Stories. The Fun They Had, and The Dead Past, from Earth is Room Enough. The Last Question, from 9 Tomorrows. The Dying Night, and The Billiard Ball from Asimov's Mysteries. And see, all of these are already elsewhere, so it's just a gathering of some of the more popular stories. I mean, Nightfall, it's a great classic. The Martian Way is a pretty well-established classic. The Fun They Had has been reprinted dozens and hundreds of places. No one even knows how many now. And of course, The Last Question is the one story he wrote that it's like everybody kind of, isn't there a story about some machine where they're trying to figure out what to do about entropy or something, and the computer ends with, and what's that story? Yeah, it's The Last Question by Isaac Asimov. And yes, I've covered that already as well. So there's all of these, and then only one story that's new to this volume, and that's Mirror Image. It gets collected in other volumes, such as The Complete Robot. So it is discoverable. But it is, as far as I could tell, I couldn't see any textual differences between the one release and the other, except that you have the artwork. Put that again with a little more appreciation. And there is a blurb here on the next page, this little square place, which reads, Elijah Bailey could understand how two humans could tell exactly equal but opposite stories. One of them was lying. But robots can't tell lies. It's a violation of the laws of robotics. And here were two robots telling exactly the same story, except they contradicted each other on every point. Well, it's not really clear where in the laws of robotics lies would be of themselves impossible. And obviously they're not in this story because one of them is telling lies. But they've been ordered to, and or they've been persuaded by virtue of the first law that it's important for them to tell the lie to protect this person who might have more at stake than that person. So I've kind of given away about as much as I can. That's what I have for the story. It's a good story. Sadly, it's only a short story, but it's like having another chapter of those two great former books in the series. So, thanks for listening.